Welcome, everybody. Welcome to episode 86 of the Drew Pavlou Show, the live stream. Today we've got John MacGowan and we've got Kos Samaras. Kos Samaras is a famous left-wing pollster in Australia. He's done a lot of work for the Teals. He's done a lot of work polling on progressive politics in Australia, polling national attitudes. He's a big supporter of multiculturalism and migration. And we've got John MacGowan as well. John MacGowan is a conservative, recently ran as an independent in Tasmania. And how would you like to describe yourself, John, quickly?
I don't know, like just bad boy of Australian right-wing politics, Drew. Like,
Good stuff. So maybe we'll give it a minute for more people to join. But no, great to have both of you guys. Thank you so much. I'll just quickly post the link as well. If you guys want to post the link, it'd be excellent.
Yeah, I just reposted it. Yeah.
Live Cosby versus John MacGowan. Excellent. All right. So, how should we start? I think we all agree right here that obviously there is a very high rate of migration in Australia right now. The demographics of Australia have changed quite extensively over the past 20 years. I think all three of us would agree on those points. I guess the question then becomes almost like a kind of philosophical one, whether this is a good thing for the country, whether Australia is doing well as a result of this, whether this is supporting the country. So I don't know, Kos, would you like to begin and start us off?
Permanent immigration numbers have been consistent now for years, right? So it hovers between 190, 200,000 permanent migrants every year, all the way back to 2015, probably even before that. So that's always been a constant. Now, what fluctuates quite a lot is the temporary visa class, which is, for those who are not aware, so it's a 4517 visa class and 462. That's people basically come over here for working holidays, backpackers, and of course student, for studying purposes. That jumps up and down quite a lot. And I would say over the last couple of years, that's been more elevated than, I would say, the permanent side of it. The permanent side hasn't really changed all that much. It's still on par with what it was like 10 years ago. So really, we should be having a conversation as to if migration's causing this problem, then it's those temporary holiday backpackers, students that are potentially causing it. And I'll argue that's not the case.
Okay.
Our housing problem's a lot more deeper than that.
Okay. And John, do you want to give an opening statement as well? Like responding to that, explaining your position too?
Well, I think, you're right insofar as, certain visa classes effectively hold steady every year because they're capped by the government. But I mean, the issue we're talking about is net overseas migration. It's the net that is going up. We're talking about very significant increases post-COVID. I mean, there's been periods of time where we've had elevated and very below average levels of migration over the last 30 to 40 years in Australia. The issue now, the reason we're talking about this, the reason why Australians are talking about marching against this is because there is a perception, which I think can be backed up by some of this data, that the policy settings have changed considerably since the end of COVID, and that there was a stated goal by the government post-COVID to make up for the lost year that we had. And now we have well and truly moved beyond that. And we're moving beyond that in terms of international student visas. We're now seeing even what I simply call the abuse of things like the working holiday visa program. And we are seeing elevated level. I mean, we are seeing the percentage of foreign-born Australians grow. And we know that data because we get it from you. So we are seeing these things happening in real time in our country. It is leading to dramatic tensions, escalating tensions. I don't think it's worth quibbling about the data on it because, just the line keeps going up, right? It doesn't matter which way you slice it. The net migration line keeps going up.
If we look at vacancy rates in Sydney and Melbourne, where they are the worst, they are acutely more problematic in the inner parts of those two cities and in certain suburbs which are landlocked, right? So core problem there is two things. One, it's highly expensive and hard to access affordable rental properties where the property prices are absolutely obscene, right? So particularly in Sydney. In Sydney, the median house price is 1.5 million, right across the entire city. I mean, that is completely and utterly unaffordable for anyone, of Drew's generation. I'm not sure how old you are, John, but you're probably still in
Immortal.
that space.
Yeah,
that's right. Immortal, that's right. This is the core problem, right? Young people cannot buy a home in Sydney, full stop, unless their parents help them, and they have to be wealthy parents, right? And this is the core problem. Now, do migrants contribute to that? Probably on the edges, but it's not the core issue. The core issue is we have this obscene housing market that's been in place for 20 years, and one government after another, red, blue, pink, it doesn't really matter, have all rejoiced the explosion of property prices in this country for the last 20 years. Heck, we've even got a reality TV program that's one of the most successful reality TV programs in TV history in this country. True. A block that rejoices building highly expensive homes.
True,
right?
That is true.
The reason, Drew, you cannot rent where you want to rent, which is inner Brisbane where you grew up, is because the median house price in inner Brisbane will make everyone's eyes water. And of course, that then translates to rents, right?
Well, I think the two things are uncoupled, Kos. I think, we have a housing affordability crisis that's preventing people from buying homes, whether it's for a first home or as investors, which is driven by the failure to build new homes. It is, as you say, on the edges that is being caused by migrants. But fundamentally, that is an economic problem, and it's because of things like the government's failure to tackle negative gearing. It's because of the political issues around you can't have that line go down, right? Yeah. But this is translating precisely to rents, and you can go to any inner city rental inspection at 6 a.m. in the morning, and they're queued up around the block. And I mean, I'm sure Drew's done it. Everyone's
I've seen that.
It.
Yeah,
that is where you can see the physical reality of migration. Because if you took the people who are recent migrants out of those queues, they are a lot smaller. And whether or not the numbers of that bear out, if you were to drill down into it, I don't think matters when people are standing there in those queues, when Heritage Australians stand there and say, well, this is why I can't get a rental and this is why I can't buy a house. Perception is everything. I'm sure you tell your clients that at RedBridge. True. When the government is losing the perception battle, then the number just keeps going up, right? There might have been, if we had been having this conversation 2 years ago, we might have been able to have these nuances. The government might have been able to soberly convince people. But one, it's too late for that. Two, I don't think that the case even makes sense anymore. I don't think you can convince people of it because I think now it's gone too far. So that becomes the crux of the debate. I mean, where does it go from here?
I want to say as well, this is interesting. I'll just quickly say one thing, Kos, as well, because I know we've started this out as an economic argument. I think this is something for later in the discussion, but I think it would also be worthwhile discussing the cultural element as well. I know, like John's made the comment, Heritage Australian. I think it'd be interesting as well to talk about questions of national identity, etc. But let's keep going. Let's keep going with housing for now.
I mean, just quickly on those visual cues, right? Okay, so they're more diverse in the line. Well, they would be in Sydney and Melbourne because basically Sydney and Melbourne now are extremely diverse cities, full stop, and that is probably a direct result of the last 15 years of migration, right? Which we've seen a very significant increase, 2 million permanent residents since 2010. So under the coalition government as well, have come to this country and become permanent residents. So the country is just a lot more diverse. The thing about the importance, let's park aside what impact that may have, in my opinion, on the edges to the housing market. I think it's important to also acknowledge that nation states that do well in history are the ones that do not close their borders, do not limit migration. Now, the problem we have in countries like the UK at the moment is it's not legal migration that's causing the problem. It is absolutely gangbusters illegal migration that is absolutely causing massive demographic disruption in not just the UK, but across parts of Europe. And governments there have not been as forceful as they have here to limit to make it harder for people smugglers to basically perform that act of shipping people across borders illegally. And that is
I think in the UK, though, there's two issues. You're right; they have had a history of illegal migration. I mean, the last time I was in France, that was when you couldn't get through Calais, right? I mean, they have had that going on for a while, but they are suffering from the legacy of the Boris wave. They are suffering from the exact same set of economic settings that we have, which was panic from really what we can be blunt and say is incompetent political leadership, who could not sit down and say, well, are there any other solutions to post-COVID GDP decline than simply importing more raw materials in the form of humans to be taxed and consumed, right? The Boris wave is one of their biggest problems. So I think on the point of countries...
saying, just quickly on that, are you saying, so in Australia, I mean, the permanent migration intake post-COVID has been on par with previous years prior to COVID. So it's about 200,000, give or take. It's about 180 to 200,000 across a 10-year period, including the post-COVID years. Now,
but if we had the international...
Yeah. The temporary migration is what you're talking about.
Yeah. So we end up with this scenario where we end up with a quantum for I think it's 2023, where you end up with 784,000 in 1 year. Now, they're not leaving it straight away, and many of these international students do not leave. They seek citizenship afterwards, or they're on their working holiday visas that go for 3 years. So I think it's kind of a moot point to quibble about visa classes when if you're standing in the queue, then it doesn't matter. If you're standing in the queue at the rental, it doesn't matter what visa class the person standing next to you has.
I want to ask Kos this because
on that. I just want to take Drew on this point. So I tend to not really get into the space of I won't argue against whether we are having too many overseas students or too many individuals coming here on tourist working visas and so on. But what I will say is the country, if it wants to wind them back, has to have an honest conversation about how poorly diverse our economy is. We have effectively mining, the knowledge economy, which is what this human product is reliant upon immensely, right? And our housing market, which is, of course, a pyramid scheme, right? And effectively the three things that work in this country. Everything else is all peripherally. So we've exported most of our ability to produce material in a very big way. And these are the three main things in our economy. So we have to slaughter one of them to fix this problem. See, we're in a catch-22 situation.
Because I fully accept that,
our economy is so poorly diverse that we kind of like stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Well, you're right. You're exactly right about that. But, I mean, to take it back to the point you made before about, unsuccessful countries with closed borders, I don't see China bringing in 800,000 Indians. Right?
Yeah, but they are... But Drew, you'll know this. I mean, they are confronting a massive fertility problem. I mean, their fertility
that is true. That is certainly true.
Northeastern part of China is like 0.5.
That is true. That is true.
You can fix fertility problems, right? They're not hard to fix. You can fix them by having an incredibly strong economy and a prosperous society where people don't have to work 2 jobs to put down deposits on houses that they'll never pay off. The fertility problem can be solved. No one wants to have to solve the fertility problem in an environment where our population has grown so much beyond what we can afford to manage. And this is, like you say, the challenge with our ridiculous simplistic economy. What are your options at this point? Like you said, which one do you get rid of? I mean, we're getting to the stage where you might even have to have a recession to adjust things. And it's going to take a complete shift in the mindset of our political leaders, the kind that we're only seeing now in the United States, where politicians actually look at the electorate and say, the most important thing is not the GDP line going up anymore. Whereas here, that is all we are doing. That is all they seem to care about is housing price line goes up, GDP line goes up, and the consequence of that is the number of people who are coming into our country year on year goes up.
The only way you're going to get young people to have kids in this country is to make it easy, to make it more affordable for them to live. The only way you do that is you've got to collapse property prices. And it will be a brave politician blue, red, or pink, or whatever it is, to tell millions of Australians who are sitting on mortgages that their equity is about to get wiped out. Right?
That's true. That's true.
You're right. It's going to take a brave politician, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. Australian political history is replete with examples of brave politicians doing things that guys like you and I have sat in their offices and shown them polling on that are desperately unpopular. I mean, there's the famous story that, Linton Crosby walks into John Howard's office with a bit of paper that says 11% of the population support the GST, right? John Howard didn't say, oh, well, screw the piece of paper, right? We're not doing it. He said, how do we make that 50%? Now, in today's political world, that conversation doesn't happen anymore. And what is essentially happening is our politicians are they're not leading, they're being led by people like you, by the you on the other side, who are saying, well, look, the demographics are changing. You've got to appeal to these new people. You can't piss off the boomers because they're just stubbornly refusing to die and they're not selling their houses. And instead of anyone saying, well, how do we change everyone's mind? How do we convince people to either make sacrifices or come up with new policies? They're saying, well, the solution is more migrants. We'll just keep bringing them in. And it doesn't matter how much worse things get. That's the direction the country's in.
I wouldn't say it's more migrants. I think the problem, and I'm one of the few out there that advocate for a policy agenda that completely skews towards younger Australians. And it's an absolute tragedy that as a researcher watching the pessimism out there amongst younger Australians right across the board. Doesn't matter how they're voting. Doesn't matter who you speak to, whether they're voting Green or Liberal or One Nation or Labor. It doesn't matter. They are all extremely pessimistic about the future. And they know their quality of life is going to be drastically different to their parents and their grandparents. And they could see that because that's clear. They've probably got more in mind. Yeah, sorry.
And this is why things are starting to get so bad because, with nothing to look forward to, they're turning inwards. And with the added pressure of, 5 years of, migration, particularly from, the Middle East, we're now getting distracted with problems like, the war in Israel, which were not things that Australians who would have died in a ditch over 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. I mean, in 2003, the majority of Australians went out, we marched peacefully against the war in Iraq. There was no burning of flags, there was no tearing each other down on television. People weren't screaming Zionists at each other or terrorists at each other. We were able to have a sober conversation about a thing that was going on the other side of the world that we were involved in that would cost 47 of our lives. And we were able to do that peacefully. And now we can't do that. And it does make you wonder, I mean, what is the underlying cause of that? Because it cannot simply be the case that there's been a massive culture shift independent of our population and our demographics. Because when you look at these protests, when you look at what's happening in our country, it really leads you to this inescapable conclusion that things have considerably changed. Like everyone keeps saying on Twitter, all three of us are Greek, right? Our grandfathers and our fathers did not come to this country in the wake of a debilitating civil war in Greece and land here and say it's time to continue the fight against nationalism, right? They didn't say that.
Yeah,
they got to work on the snowy hydro and they opened shops and they put all those things behind us. And today, when you go into a Hellenic club in any capital city or in regional town, there are Greeks sitting around tables eating baklava and drinking coffee, Greek coffee, not Turkish coffee, who probably fought on the opposite side of the war, whose families fought on the opposite side of that war, right? So what has changed?
There aren't Greeks attacking Turkish businesses and Turkish consulates in Australia,
And I would wager antipathy from Greeks towards Turks in the wake of the Second World War, antipathy from Greeks towards the British in the wake of the Civil War was just as aggressive and virulent as between Jews and Palestinians. And yet, how does our country react peacefully? And I can tell you why I believe it is, because I looked this up before I came on the stream. Right, the year my grandfather came to Australia in 1950, in the year when, the word wog enters the Australian lexicon, he walked off a boat in a 12-month period of just 5,089 Greeks, right? Yeah. It wasn't like one day, 800,000 Greeks and 800,000 Italians walked off a boat from the ruins of Europe and formed enclaves and started, bringing their culture with them. That didn't happen. It was a slow burn. And this is how we've run our migration system for now close to 100 years.
There's a bit of, but look, I get what you're saying here. The issue with regards to the Middle East conflict right now, it's animated by what I would define people who are not from those communities, right? So the people that are really active, whether it's in the on the Palestinian side or on the Jewish side in this country, most of it is not from those very communities. I live in Melbourne's northwestern suburbs. I can tell you it's very quiet, very peaceful. There's no graffiti anywhere. No MP's offices are being graffitied, right? Even leading up to the election. All the disruption was in town where there were Green Labor contests, where the Muslim communities are situated. Yeah, I may have seen one. Actually, I saw more Palestinian flags in Greece when I was over there recently than I did in my own suburb that borders Roxburgh Park.
It is big in Athens. It is big in Athens.
Very big in Athens.
But I mean, you've shown this data before on Twitter. I mean, and don't you think there's an element here that our politicians are reacting to something because of a perception? And again, we're back to perception. But just like there's a perception on the ground, there's a perception in the cabinet rooms that because of the changing demography, they need to change the decades-long consensus on what side of the Middle Eastern troubles they fall on. Right? Don't you think there's an element of that happening? Because it seems very unusual that, particularly from the Labor Party, which has been arguing about Palestine and Israel for a generation, that it's just going to turn on a dime like it has. Is there no element of the changing demographics there?
Maybe not. I'm not sure. I'm not in that room, right? But I would say that their Labor's electoral coalition is now made up of a number of different cornerstones. So one obviously is middle class, what I'll define as white professionals in the inner parts of our large cities with a university degree. The other component is diverse Australia, which will have all sorts of mixed views on this conflict. The Indian diaspora and the Chinese diaspora in particular will have very, very different views on this conflict than, for example, those probably in the Muslim community. They are much bigger and more important electorally to Labor than I would say the Muslim community is. But yet, Labor has made this decision. So what I'm arguing here is that I don't think it is purely just electoral politics. Because if it was, there are things in their base, bits and pieces in their base, which are massive. Like, 85% of the Indian diaspora voted for the Labor Party at the last election. We'll give thereabouts. It varies across the country.
What was the number? Sorry, Kos?
About 85%. In our polling, whenever we poll them, they're about that. Two-party preferred. Huge numbers. Now, that may change.
And that's not in a vacuum, I mean. The Liberals tried to get those votes and failed. Correct. So it's not like they're just naturally like that. Yeah.
No, correct. Yeah. And so, and look, and they should be, these two communities, let's just quickly focus on them, should be voting Conservative. They are socially conservative, aspirational, small business entrepreneurs, and they're voting for Labor, and I would argue for sectarian reasons, because we interviewed a whole bunch of young Indian men in Sydney, probably about 6 months ago, and long conversation with them. And we said, okay, so what are your values? What do you think of the cost of living crisis right now? Their response, I just work harder, right? Which is, of course, that cultural thing, right? If you're faced with hardship, double down, right? And we went through all their values across a whole range of things, and they're clearly conservative. They should be voting Liberal. So we said to them, so why aren't you voting Liberal? They don't like us.
I'm really concerned, though, Kos, for the future of the country. If we do get these really sectarian voting blocks forming, wouldn't the perception be among conservative Australians that, I already see this on Twitter all the time. People say that this is Labor's strategy to have the large numbers of migration to change the voting base. And that is what people would be concerned by.
Yeah. So if you look at the last election, those who were from diverse backgrounds and may have migrated to this country, I think the latest you could have arrived here was 2019. So probably under the Morrison government. Anyone after that probably still going through the process of permanent residency and the whole sequence that it takes. It takes a long time to get your voting rights. And having said that, the pattern of when my parents migrated out here, John, your example, it took them about 15 years before they actually enrolled to vote and voted. It was a long time. Now it's much shorter. So it's about,
it's 4 years. Yeah.
Yeah, it's 4 to 6 years, give or take.
4 years is really short. Is that good for the country, do you think, Kos?
No, sometimes look, in reality, it's longer. A lot of people are reluctant to take that step for cultural reasons, right?
Okay.
So it is longer, particularly within the Chinese diaspora. They've got lower levels of enrollment than the Indian diaspora does. For all those, political sensitive issues that we can talk about for hours, which of course, Drew, you're very
which gets to the issues about multiculturalism, etc. I mean, I reject the assertion that what we are seeing is some kind of like complicated ethnic branch stacking from.
I don't think that. I
don't believe that, because at the end of the day, these are Scott Morrison's migrants.
That's true. I agree with you on that. Yeah.
These were Scott Morrison and Alex Hawke's immigration settings that we're dealing with the consequence of today. But back to my point before, is that we now live under a political regime where you only change course when absolutely required and with the backing of your constituents. And so there's no appetite from anyone, and there would be none from the Susan Labor Party, should they ever be relevant, to actually turn this around, because they're now looking at it and looking at the numbers and going, well, they're here now and they vote for us. So there's no appetite for change. And I don't think there ever will be from the current crop of politicians. So I think that the discussion around the politics of it is kind of redundant, because it's going to be what happens kind of socially, and what is going to happen with emerging political movements over the next couple of years. That is where you might see a change come from. Yeah,
look, on that point, I mean that's an important point that we should talk about, and that is there is Labor won convincingly, but there's still a very significant hunger out there amongst younger Australians for an alternative. 50% of Gen Z voted for something other than the major parties at the last election. Now they sprayed all over the place, right? You contrast that to baby boomers, which is 85%, and Gen X 70 plus, and Gen X, when they were in their 20s, were voting 70 plus for the major party, right? So my generation. So the reason we isolate Gen Z in particular, but also to a lesser extent millennials, is that they are behaving drastically different, and they're looking for that alternative. Now, I say this to conservatives, they say, oh, look, what's happened in the UK and the US with Trump, attracting younger voters. I said, yeah, but they're not establishment, right? They're not the problem with the Liberal Party is they're part of the furniture. Trump.
Trump, that's why no one wants to vote for them.
Yeah, that's right. Trump literally replaced the GOP. And in the UK, Farage, well, he's not conservative, is he? Right? He's not hanging around. I mean, clearly his popularity is because he's anti-establishment.
And we're seeing this across the board. We're seeing it all over Europe. You are seeing it everywhere. You're even seeing new emerging nationalist parties in Japan, which don't have a great history of nationalism.
True.
So, this is something
we agree with you on the migration thing. On the migration thing, So where I agree with you on the migration thing is that if you're in politics today, if you don't want people to rest their attention on migration as an issue, then you need to address the economic undercurrents that are causing that anxiety. So it's no point, saying, well, here are the facts and so on, but then don't address the reason why people are feeling anxious about it all. And because if you don't address
it, become too late for that.
Yeah.
Doesn't it become a bit too late for that, though, when everyone starts noticing? I mean, there's the famous quote from Bob Hawke from the early 1990s from one of his biographers, where he said, we've known that immigration is, just incredibly unpopular. We've always known no one really wants it. And so we've tried to keep it off the front pages. I mean, this was a foundation of politics in Australia. No one ever wanted to talk about it. John Howard made it about boat people who came over in their dozens, instead of talking about the million that he was bringing over on planes.
It was a bait and switch with Howard.
Yeah, I mean, remember when poor Christina Keneally tried to talk about plane people and she was screamed at from across every section of politics, right? So we've never had this discussion. It's been deliberately obfuscated by our politicians, and it sharpened their resolve to actually solve economic matters, because the last thing you wanted was the public really noticing. And I think that genie's out of the bottle now. And Australians are going to take a lot of convincing to, accept the current. I mean, like you say, if you look at these, these permanent visas that do actually hold steady over time.
Yes.
We can't even go back to that now, right? I don't think you're going to be able to convince the Australian public, or at least when we, whatever amorphous blob we call, heritage Australians who sound like us at least, we're never going to be able to convince those people of that again now, without, putting in some real effort or putting in some genuine reform and achieving, new heights of prosperity for the Australian public that we haven't seen before. Because right now, like we're at real wages right now are sitting at 2008 levels, and we've got a government that keeps telling us we're doing better than ever. When people look in their wallet, they look at the shelves of the supermarket, they look at the real estate prices, and they look at their power prices, they look at the petrol pump, and they say, no, I'm not doing better. And I can only detect one change socially, which is everyone in my neighborhood is now Indian. So isn't it that point that, the numbers, the data, the visas, it all becomes redundant because you've lost the Australian people. The only thing that's saving these guys, I believe the only thing that's saved, these, planned protests from being riots is that it is like the most uncharted territory of Australian politics is whether anyone can even say it out loud. Because the average Australian cannot voice these concerns. You can't go into your office around the water cooler and say, hey, you notice how many immigrants there are now? Like, you can't say that. You lose your job, right? We can all talk about it openly because we're, consultants and streamers and financially independent. Millions of Australians aren't. You would be ostracized at home and you would be, kicked out of your social club.
But again, we've got to be careful. Yeah, John, we've got to be careful here because, we're all products of our own social network as well. So what you think is the average Australian might be actually statistically different, right? So what I'm trying to tell you is I don't think there is a critical mass of people who actually oppose immigration. I think that when we talk to young people, no, they're there. I'm not saying they don't exist. Absolutely. I'm not saying, and this is the thing I get, when we deal in stats, I get a bit, I'm always a bit frustrated when people just think in absolute terms. Yeah, okay. There were people that voted for the coalition. There are baby boomers that vote progressive. There are, there always are exceptions. But the majority of Australians, what you will find are not in that space. They are, if you were to talk to the majority of younger Australians in particular, they will blame the corporatisation of our housing industry, the whole range of things before they even get to immigration is a problem. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not the epicenter of a lot of people's lives that I think some people in the right think it is. But
on the latest figures, we're looking at 55% of Australia, 55% now say it is too high. I think that was a YouGov poll.
There was there was one in West Sydney during the election that 80% of West Sydney wanted to lower the numbers.
Yes, but what I'm getting at though, putting aside the data and whether or not the data, where the data comes from or whatever, you got to admit it's unprecedented at this point. I mean, after going through the late 1990s with Pauline Hanson, the boat people fiasco and people overboard with Howard, to go from those periods in our history, even including to when you had literal Nazis running in elections in the 1970s, we have never had pushback to this extent on just the actual legal migration numbers, and we've never had the discussion around it. I think this is happening for the first time, and it just seems like our politicians are, they're ignoring it. We've got Tony Burke in the newspaper today saying that it's un-Australian to go outside with an Australian flag and march against immigration growth. Those are the exact words of our...
When you say we've never had it, I would say what's happening now is the right is more, and those with those views are more comfortable in expressing them, right? That's the case, right? People feel a bit more liberated to express their views, and that's fine, but what I say, the majority of Australians are not there on this. Now, they might have a view about, the intake is a bit high, whatever it is. But they're not walking around going, geez, there's a lot of Indians in my suburb, right? That's not something I see in research, but equally, even my own social networks, it's just, and I have quite a few conservative Greeks in my social networks, right? They have mixed views, right? And so I think there's a lot of... Sorry.
I see a lot of young guys radicalizing and getting
That's different. That's a different problem.
But
Yeah.
my fear is that I look at those Nazi guys and they are growing in numbers, and I get shocked sometimes by how extreme I encounter young people. And my worry is that like, unless we lower migration and remove the saliency of this issue, my worry is that it's just going to, I don't want it to build to a UK type level where I look at the UK and it actually looks like they're on the verge of civil conflict, at least probably on the scale of the Troubles. Like, if you're talking about sort of like low level civil conflict, I think that's honestly where the UK is.
The UK, you live outside of London, you're economically screwed. Right?
Yeah,
the economic situation in the UK is, and a lot of part of the US is just absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
And if you're young and you're living in Birmingham, for example, you are absolutely, absolutely screwed, right? And it's so, I get why that is a powder keg in that country. No, there's no question about that. What I think, is really at the epicenter of a lot of young people, and an element of them that are becoming radicalized is, we've done a lot of work in this space, is that they are, generally speaking, pushing back against establishment. Now, some of it manifests from a right-wing perspective. Some of it's manifesting in the left-wing perspective. And you guys have seen it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just as active on the left wing as it is on the right wing.
That's true.
And the drivers behind it are largely the same. So it's economic disempowerment, a sense that they're not controlled, they will never be in control of their destiny, right? And something baby boomers had, they were the most prosperous generation in human history, full stop, right? It's just right. So we got that element there. If they were living in the Western world, that is. And you got younger people that are looking at them and going, well, that's not me. That's never going to be me. And I've got the shits about it, right?
Yeah.
And that's, manifesting in all sorts of ways. Now, governments, established players, have taken the eye off the ball here, and we're having what we're seeing now, right? Which is all these elements that you're talking about.
Look, I think on Drew's point, I mean, how Australians are radicalizing is, it's regionally different a lot. And I think, there is a significant outlier in Victoria and in Melbourne and Melbourne's surrounds. And, when people are looking at what's happening with chaps in all black going marching, or they're looking at people in all black, attacking people for having different views on gender, as we saw yesterday, carrying, Death to Australia flags, I don't see that down here in Hobart. You don't see that in Sydney with its larger population. You don't see that in Brisbane. People are radicalizing, but I mean, it's a difficult construction. But I think in the main, young people are radicalizing moderately, based on mostly on the things they see online through the streaming community or emerging alternative media. We have a huge problem in Victoria, like in Melbourne. We have a massive problem with how that government deals with the fringes of politics, which is exacerbating it and taking, young guys who probably should have just been in One Nation and young people who should have just been in the Greens, and they are turning them into radical cells.
Actually communists and fascists.
Yeah. And it's been happening down there for a while. And so, I think it's
probably pandemic related too, by the way.
Well, exactly. But I mean, look, the lockdowns were everywhere, but they were worse there.
No, they were very. So we've done. I've spent many years studying this stuff, and obviously I had a very strong view about near the end where this was going socially for a lot of young people in Melbourne, and all of it was ugly. All of it was going to be ugly, and then what happened is governments came out of lockdown, and what they should have done is double down in trying to help these young people get through life, because if you look at who was disproportionately hit the hardest, it was basically young people. If they were in jobs, they lost them. They had their critical part of their life massively disrupted. Now, I can go back to when I was in my early 20s. If I had those years wiped out, I'd still be, I would not be here where I am today. That's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a different issue. It'd be fun to have less of a debate and just a roundtable on, how crazy Victoria is and how it got there. I mean, but to bring it back to immigration, though, the interesting point that I notice is, in the tail end of that, it really did feel like the near civil unrest, the protest movements, and they're pretty cringy, but the freedom movement guys that we had emerge out of Victoria, that there really was a feeling from our politicians that actually this is something we should avoid, and we saw a moderating of COVID policies very quickly. I mean, as soon as they were able to, we saw the vax mandates swept under the rug, mask mandates. We saw all that stuff that had been, we were told was necessary or the sky was going to fall in. We saw all that disappear really quickly once they realised how deeply, deeply unpopular it is. We're not seeing that with immigration, though. We've got, there are, some 500 national socialists in the country campaigning against immigration now, something we haven't had in this country in 50 years, right? We've now got ordinary people saying, I'm going to go out in the streets with flags, and I'm going to march against it. It's, this issue is now growing, and the government is doing zero, right? It was a policy of the Labor Party to address this. It was a policy of the Labor Party to reduce immigration at the last election. We've seen none of it. In fact, we've just seen them put international student numbers up. So why do you think it is that we're not seeing any political action? Are they just not worried? Are they not scared? Like, it seems.
Well, I'll argue they're probably seeing what I'm seeing, and that is that the radicalization of people is not necessarily migration. It's migration's another issue that the radicalized group is grabbing onto and aerating and campaigning on, right? Underlying all of that is still the root cause of these problems are far more deeper and complex. And so they know that people are going to go out there and march against immigration, but it ain't the critical mass. My argument here is, if you want social cohesion in this country, it isn't migration. It's reducing numbers is not going to fix this problem. It's the fact that the median price in Sydney is 1.5 million for a 2-bedroom shitter in the outer suburbs of Sydney that takes you, with 70 kilometres out from the CBD.
Oh, that's
right?
So messed up. Yeah,
that's.
But they're not touching that either.
Right? Yeah, that's right. But that's the core problem here, right? And that's, unless the economic depravity that is befalling an entire generation is fixed or addressed or be seen to be someone's trying to fix it, you're going to get these explosions of outbursts. You're going to see what we saw out of the pandemic was really a preview, right?
And the first of its kind, right?
Yeah,
and,
that's right.
And are we really willing to accept that this is the new normal? Like,
yes,
I'm a self-confessed radical and occasional extremist, right? I'm not willing to. I don't want this to be the new normal, right? I don't want you people in the chat agreeing with me and people on Twitter agreeing with me. I like being out on the fringes, but that is a terrifying prospect to say that a policy prescription from successive governments have just undermined the cultural stability of our country. I mean, potentially irreparably. And
I think we should discuss the cultural element too. And there's one quick thing I want to mention, Kos. That anecdote you made before was pretty concerning to me when you said that you think the main thing driving some of this polarization in ethnic voting is actually straight sectarianism. And that makes me really concerned for the future of the country.
That's because one group of Australians feel like one political party has been in the business of basically opposing them. Now, that's not necessarily being the case. So John Howard was really good at avoiding this, right? Yeah. And but I think his successors were not that great, and they didn't hold discipline. And basically, these Australians, many of them now, when we talk about the Indian and Chinese diaspora, for example, they're your doctors, they're your nurses. They are, they contribute absolutely positively to Australian society. They are voting more on sectarian reasons than they are on socially conservative reasons. Now, that may not, let's put a big caveat on this, because if we were having this discussion in the 1970s and 80s, you would think that the Greek and Italian diaspora is going to vote Labor for the rest of their lives. True. The kid went on, and I would argue that most of their children, Gen X and younger, are voting Conservative today. Right? They're voting for the Liberal Party and other minor parties that are of the right. So that does change.
I want to ask, so when it comes to, for example, Chinese diaspora politics, I know you've said, Kos, that the Liberal Party has really alienated this group of people. My biggest concern, and of course, like there was a comment, I forget who made it. It was one of the Liberal senators at the last election who made a really silly, idiotic comment in like the last week of the cabinet. Yeah, basically saying that anyone campaigning for the Labour Party who was Chinese was a spy. That is obviously stupid. Absolutely, that's stupid. My absolute concern though is, I think Israel-Palestine, we've seen a lot of chaos on our streets. My concern is if China invades Taiwan, what is that going to look like for our country? I'm really concerned that I look at, for example, it seems that there's about basically 4 or 5 seats that have very large Chinese Australian populations. So it's like Reed, Bennelong, Chisholm, etc. And it seems that the Labor Party has kind of internalized the lesson. They basically said this at the 2022 federal election review, that if a party is seen to be tough on China, they will alienate that community, and that community will really strongly vote based on. It's
deeper than that. Yeah, so let's go to Western Australia, for example. Every miner in Western Australia will tell you they like trade with China.
Of course, I'm not surprised that the miners in Western Australia do. Yeah,
like they are very big, and I would say the big swings against the Morrison government in 2022 in Western Australia were in part, not entirely, a manifestation of that. Western Australians look towards China and Asia before they look to the East Coast, right? Because their livelihood is dependent on it. So we've got to be sensitive that we literally are, our economy stapled to the Chinese economy, right? And so again, we go back to the uncomplicated nature of our economy here: mining, housing, knowledge economy. Knowledge economy and mining, where does that resource come from?
Can I give you one anecdote, Kos? So you probably have seen on my Twitter. So in 2023, I got called in by the Australian Federal Police, and they essentially told me that in 2022 they had raided a Chinese individual in Australia who was part of a Chinese foreign intelligence plot, basically to find my address and harm me. And nobody was ever arrested as a result of that plot. They raided people as a result of it. They put a lot of pressure on me never to go public with it. They basically never wanted me to ever discuss it in the media. It basically took me I basically sat on it for like a full year before I went to the media, because I was kind of scared the way the federal agents talked to me. They kind of seemed to put a lot of pressure on me. My concern is that's a pretty bad thing that they're basically that's an example of the Chinese government was literally trying to harm an Australian citizen based on the things that I was saying on Twitter, right? And there was not really any there was not even an arrest. And my concern, right, is that the Labor Party and the Labor government is so concerned about alienating, say, Chinese Australian voters in those 4 or 5 seats that they won't actually stand against the Chinese government when they do really bad things in this country. That's what I'm really concerned about. And my worry is if it actually escalates to the point where, say, China invades Taiwan, I'm really worried about the implications for Australia in terms of geopolitics and the foreign policy of this country. If the government feels that these seats, they feel like, I see this a lot. I see that the politicians never try to make any distinction between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. Albanese will literally go out and say, we need a good relationship with the Chinese government because we've got a large Chinese diaspora in this country. And he doesn't even really draw a distinction between the Chinese government and the Chinese people or the Chinese Australian community. That's what I'm concerned about.
Well, most Chinese Australians would get really nervous when you conflate them, right? And so,
of course, I know, but my concern is that the government's actually conflating them.
No, what I'm trying to say here is Morrison didn't learn, the Morrison in particular, but that government discovered what happens when you don't manage that fine balancing act. And look, I wouldn't want to be in the shoes of any federal politician right now. The world is heading into a poly-conflict environment. Those of us old enough to remember the Cold War, which seemed to be, you had 2 superpowers and that was it. You now have a situation where the entire global situation is fragmented. It's probably more akin to pre-Second World War. It's a world that is completely foreign to everyone, and people are anxious about it. And governments have got their hands full managing it all, because it ain't like it used to be. It will never come back. And, the Trump administration and the way they are managing it, I would argue, is the one thing I would agree with them, and I agree or disagree with everything they're doing except for this point, which is they understand they are no longer the main power on the planet. They are one of many powers.
Unlike, however, everyone else, the Americans are trying to fix that. And, everyone else is shrinking from the challenge of the 21st century and the challenges of Chinese imperialism, the challenges of Russian imperialism. The Americans are flying B-2 Spirit bombers over Putin's head to remind him that they've got more stuff than he does. So I think, look, the Americans are taking a different approach to us. My problem, like you say, you wouldn't want to be in their shoes. I mean, they've brought this on themselves. This is what happens when people who shouldn't be flying a plane fly the plane. It crashes, right? We've had a generation of politicians that don't belong there, who aren't qualified to do it, and who are sitting there, reading polls and going, well, how do I balance the Chinese community with the Indian community and make sure I get the right percentage of Zoomers and don't annoy anyone, and then I'll get my required votes and then I can get a car. We don't have leadership in this country anymore. And
I guess
that's why things are getting so bad.
I guess this is how we can start going to the cultural aspect, because I guess what I'm concerned about, Kos, is how do we avoid balkanization or, say, fragmentation of the Australian population and society? Because, I'll give you an example. Back in the 90s, the Australian Soccer League, it used to be dominated by the sort of white ethnic clubs, right? Like the Yugoslav, like the countries of the former Yugoslavia. And the National Soccer League basically had to be shut down because they were basically ethnic riots constantly between, the Croatian fans, the Serbian fans. There was a lot of that was an example, right? Now that was such a small. I mean, in the grand scheme of things in Australian society, there were even Croatian terror cells in Australia at one point. But in the grand scheme of things in Australian society, the numbers were so small that, Yugoslav. I guess the conflict exported from Yugoslavia to Australia never really threatened the Australian.
I'll argue we don't see that from the Chinese community.
Not now, of course, no. I agree with you there.
No, I don't think. Yeah. I don't even think if it happened, I don't think we have to worry about Australia's Chinese community.
Yeah, I agree.
Those guys aren't going to take to the streets. The problem, though, is there is a deeper problem there, and it goes back to these failures of government. The reason why you won't see that is because successive federal governments have abysmally failed our Chinese diaspora, which in Australia dates back to the middle of the 18th century.
Been here a long time.
And these folks are scared. They're terrified because they know that there are badged Chinese police in this country. They know that there are MSS agents that operate with impunity because whether it's a Liberal or Labor government, they have no interest in really prosecuting Chinese foreign interference beyond having Mike Burgess stand up every few months and putting his hands on his hips and say, stop spying. Right, we don't actually have any tackling of that problem, and the Chinese community knows it. So the Chinese community are politically disengaged, and they've got their heads down, going, "God, I hope they don't notice me."
I think to be fair to them and to be fair to the intelligence community, I think they absolutely know and are doing a lot of work behind the scenes. But
that's true.
But they say that they've been saying that for years. I mean, you and I know the history of the Chinese influence over Australian politics better than anyone. Huang Zhimao, the man who was funneling cash into the pockets of Jamie Clements in Sussex Street, he was due to appear at ICAC. And our government and the intelligence community thought the best course of action was to bundle him onto a plane and send him back to Shanghai. Right? We've never had a single Chinese spy see the inside of a courtroom. In fact, in the history of Australia, more Russians have seen the inside of courtrooms. I think we've taken more jobs off Israelis than we have Chinese spies. And we know these people are everywhere. We've met them, because we know who they are. And this government does nothing about it. And it's is it just the incompetence that they think, we just don't want to annoy them? Is it that they have a misconception that the Chinese community doesn't want them to engage? Or, are they compromised themselves? And the public has a right to ask that question.
Or the other option is it's just too damn hard and they don't have enough evidence on them. I mean,
well, you know what? You're very right. I mean, it could just be that it's too hard, and it's like the housing crisis,
probably that.
Or infinity migration. We just
there's a thing about that space, and John, you appreciate this, and for those who are listening, whenever you think of a conspiracy, always put it down to an F up.
Yeah, that's true. I agree with you there.
Those of us who worked in politics, they're not capable.
Right? I'd love to believe. I'd love to believe my friends online who tell me the Labor Party is meeting in secret rooms, bringing in Labor Indian migrants. Right? Sussex Street it's not at the airport, filtering them out. I'd love to believe that, but I know they're not capable of doing it.
It's not that. It's just that they actually know that there'll be a recession if they lower migration. Yeah. It's something as simple as that, I think.
But it was a Labor Party Prime Minister who said there was recessions that you have to have. There are economic reforms that you have to do, even when they're hard. And it's not even on their radar. I mean, they ruled out negative gearing last week, even after doing a milquetoast, just reducing it to more than one property. I mean, negative gearing is one of the single biggest issues with our housing market.
I agree.
It's funneling, it's taking 100%. Investment properties off the market that should be for first homeowners, and it's over leveraging Australians. These people should not be in the housing market. Imagine going to a bank and saying, "Can I please have $1 million to put on the stock exchange?" Right? No one's going to loan you that. Right? Why are we loaning people $1 million to invest on? And it's because they know there's no risk. Right?
Yeah.
There's no risk in this housing market that the line goes up for infinity. So no one's interested in tackling these economic problems. I mean, when we talk about the cultural problem in Australia, this failure of politics is a certain part of it, right? Because no one wants to tackle hard things anymore.
I mean, we're a fairly, my argument here is that we're fairly, those of us who've been lucky to travel around the world, we're very lucky to live here. I mean, from my social issue, right? Right. The one thing that successive governments have done in this country over numerous decades is soften the blow for working communities that got hit by globalization. Where that didn't happen, we're seeing the political consequences of that. The UK is a really good example.
Yeah.
Right. And so, things are tough here, but I know it sounds a bit privileged to say, they could be worse, but they could be worse.
They could be, and we really do feel like we're the last outpost of Western civilization at this point. I mean, would you rather live here or the United States or the UK or Canada? And there's only one answer. Yeah. This is why these things are so important, because if Australia falls, there's nowhere else. We are the last vestige of the Anglosphere at this point, and the spirit of stability, peace, and pluralism that's defined our culture for 100 years. So it really is.
My message to my mob, being the left side of politics, is if you want to protect diverse Australia and diverse communities, which I do, you have to address the economic undercurrents that are creating the anxiety. The one thing that, as a student of history, and all of you, both of you are probably the same, appreciate the first victim when it comes to economic crisis are people who look different to us. Right, and so my point here is if this is me being the progressive talker here, right? So right, okay. So that's how I view the world, and if you want to stop that, you got to fix the economic issue. So yes, you're going to tackle negative gearing. You're going to have to tackle capital gains tax. All these, you're going to have to slay a few white elephants in the room to avoid people to avoid people that don't deserve to be targeted.
Can I ask you this, Kos? So there's obviously the economic equation. You look at Britain, for example. Like there is also the cultural element, I think, because I see that there's often this argument on the left that the only reason why xenophobia might ever exist is because of poor economic conditions, and of course that is a huge part of it. But I think, for example, there is an element of, say, like social and cultural dislocation people feel when there is mass demographic change in some of these towns in England, for example, that have basically completely changed.
Demographic upheaval, there's a term for it.
Yeah. So how do you think we should? Which one?
So demographic. Ireland's a really good example of that.
Yeah.
If you any government's got to be really careful about how they manage it, because massive demographic upheaval, no matter how progressive you are as a government, you will not contain the backlash from it. Human beings are going to be human beings, and they do not like things changing on them around them rapidly, right? And demographic upheaval is one of the key ingredients to massive social unrest. Absolutely, right? Now, I would argue that's not occurring in Australia. We're not experiencing the sort of influx that we're seeing in the UK, for example, particularly places like Ireland. That's not happening. That's why I'm here debating you guys, right? Because I think that this is not the issue. The issue is the economic problem in this country.
But I mean, the two just end up becoming inseparable. And the UK has a kind of different problem to us, because the UK has really, I think one of the challenges in Australia is we mislabeled or deliberately mislabeled the assimilation of ethnic communities in the 20th century as multiculturalism. Right.
Yeah,
and we have this mythology around multiculturalism that, Australia is a multicultural country. We're not a multicultural country. When people come here, and sure, they might bring exotic sandwiches and funny hats, and they might do a dance on, what different day of the month or whatever. But when they become so much fundamentally like us in a short space of time, as we see with every ethnic community in Australia until very recently, but in the UK has always been a multicultural project. Well, the challenge here in Australia right now is we are doing the same thing. Multiculturalism is really only just being tried in Australia now because the pressure to assimilate has been removed at every level.
I think that is.
And we now have governments. I mean, can you imagine any other government at any time in history saying to the Indian community during an election, "Here's $25 million so you can build a school where everyone speaks Hindu," right? This is something our own federal government did.
Let's check that, right? So when I was growing up, and I'm older than you two blokes, right? When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, we had Greek school.
Sure, it was Greek school on Sundays, but people still spoke English.
Right? Yeah, we still spoke English.
It wasn't state approved.
Yeah,
right?
And
what you have now.
But if you look at the statistics, Greeks in particular marrying other non-Greeks is still very low. Even amongst,
I mean, my family's a massive outlier.
Yeah. Look, it's still
sure,
so.
But I mean,
simulations are. It's an interesting thing, right? What I'm trying to say is, give it time. If you look at what's going on in the UK with the Indian community there, which has been there longer than the Indian community has been here in Australia. I mean, they had a prime minister from that background, right? Give it time. That will come with time. That's my point.
What I was going to say, Kos, is I think part of the problem is when the volume is so high, perhaps the pressure to assimilate is less. So the example I would give, right, is in the context of being a Greek Australian, I didn't go to I was never sort of in a Greek enclave growing up. So I basically only ever really spoke Greek. I spoke English. And I mean, I didn't go to a school that was completely surrounded by Greek. I think if I lived in a suburb that was say 90% Greek and everyone around me spoke Greek, I think that would be a different thing. There's this TV program in Brisbane called The Mosque Next Door. And it's led by this guy, Ali Kadri, who runs the Islamic school in Brisbane. And he's a progressive guy. He's been involved in de-radicalization efforts. I know him personally. He's a good guy, I guess. But I remember watching the show. And look, he's trying to solve the problem of integration. He's trying to solve the problem of sectarianism. The problem is I saw the TV trailer for the show. Essentially what the show was that they were taking kids from the school, which is an Islamic college, and then they were letting them do sort of school swaps with a Catholic school, etc. And obviously there's cross-cultural integration and all these sorts of things. I remember when I was watching the show, there were kids that were 10 years old, and some of them literally said, "I've never talked to a white Australian. I've never been around white Australians at all." And they were asked what do you think of when you see white Australians? And they'd say stuff like, "Oh, they drink a lot, they're bogans," that sort of thing. And I watched that, I'm like, that is such a social disaster because that's an indication, I think, of sectarianism or people not integrating in this. And it's not the kids' fault, of course. It's not the kids' fault because they're just kids. But I'm concerned that if societies become siloed, then I get really worried for the long term, the cohesiveness of the nation.
I'll give you an example. My neck of the woods is northwestern part of Melbourne, large Muslim community, but also large Syrian Christian community, large Indian community. All the public schools are mixed. Yeah. Right? Private schools is where you get the isolation occurring, right? And it's funny how you will say that, they did that cultural interchange. When I was growing up, they did a cultural interchange, all right? I was going to Broadmeadows High, and so our day excursion was going to talk to some private school students on the other side of Melbourne because we never actually spoke to each other.
Yeah, fair enough. That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah,
it's kind of and we thought they were weird, and what's with your uniform, mate? You look a bit stiff, because we didn't wear any uniforms. It's independent private schools tend to do that. In some settings with religion and ethnicity. There's no doubt about that. I mean, Alphington Grammar is a good example. Although it's mixed, it's still considered a Greek school in Melbourne.
Yeah, that's true.
When you have... Well, what you have in Australia right now, though, is a significant change from what it was like in the past. I mean, and today we call these things acts of passive racism, but in fact, they may have been enormously beneficial to send clear messages to migrant communities that English is the only language spoken in Australia, for example, right? I mean, today, there is really no reason to learn it for a lot of communities when you know that you can pick up the phone to a government agency and you're going to be spoken to in English. You know, to know that, I mean, so many jobs don't require it now. So we're seeing, I think what we're seeing is, you know, the government not necessarily endorsed, and this is one of the few things I won't blame on politicians, because this is really endorsed at a bureaucratic level, is the enabling of non-assimilation, which has never been there before. Assimilation has always been on the cards for Indigenous communities.
There were old people that I grew up with in the Greek community that didn't speak a word of English.
That's true. I do get that.
Language is one example, but I mean, you know, it becomes then about there are cultural elements in the West that these folks absorb by osmosis, right? I mean, you look at the Chinese communities, right? I would say out of all the ethnic communities, the ones that you would see the third and fourth generation of that are just indistinguishable other than epicanthic folds are the Chinese. And it's because
I do agree they assimilate very, very closely.
Of assimilation was what is the highest ambition of some of these Chinese families is to send their children to a sandstone grammar school and a sandstone university, right? So when you had that urge from a community to say, I want my kids to be like that, instead of having the state endorse your choice to have your kids not be like us,
the Indian community,
some of them are,
everyone speaks English.
But it doesn't seem like the government is kind of pushing that. The government is pushing it the other way, where they're pushing it to say, well, we want to protect your right to, you know, basically live exactly as you did in your old country, only with more expensive housing prices. Well, I mean, that's essentially what we're saying to some of these people.
Well, the Indian community, for example, I mean, you could almost say they don't have a second language; they have two languages. One is their whether it's, you know, wherever they come, whichever part of India they come from, whatever their dialect might be, but they speak fluent English. Like they are extremely proficient. 80% of over 18-year-olds in the Indian community in Australia have got a university degree. I mean, they're the most educated migrant community in this country's history. So there's nuances, right? That's my point. Like, there might be some other communities that don't want to assimilate as much, but when we're talking to the two big ones, I think we're in good hands. I mean,
but the problem for voters is that, yes, on the one hand, look, if you're in the major capital cities and you're working in the C-suites, they are full of highly educated, affluent and articulate Indians. But then they turn on their TVs and they see an Indian community in Harris Park building a 70-foot tall gold statue of Vishnu. And they're looking and go, wait, what? Right? I mean, would your parents have been allowed to build a statue of Zeus in Carlton?
Mate, we build statues. We build great big crucifixes.
You should look this one up, Kos, because it's a pretty big statue, right? And across the board, and it's not just with them, you know, and it applies to many diaspora communities and even people who've been here a long time, like, for example, the Jewish community. You have this culture now from government of what you can only call pandering, where we just throw money at them to, you know, try and live as close to how they used to as possible. And that's not how Australia was built. Australia was built on migrants coming here, often from terrible parts of the world, escaping violence, and getting here and taking a big sigh of relief, saying, well, I'm glad I'm not being hunted through the jungles of Vietnam by communists. Which football team do I follow? Right? I mean, we talk about Greeks not assimilating, right? I mean, I guarantee you, last night there were a lot more Greeks watching Carlton play than have ever would have watched Juventus during the footy season, right? When you go to Canterbury Bankstown, you know, which is one of the most incredible, you know, diverse places in the country, it's the meeting point between Greeks, Italians, Muslims, Arabs of multiple faiths, plus Indians and Chinese, all united by a sport that has never been played beyond this continent, namely NRL and the Canterbury Bulldogs, right? And it's really kind of it's a twee comparison. Like, I mean, you know, it's the sport thing, but you know, that is assimilation. When you come to a country and you get excited about the local football team, that's what assimilation looks like. And I just feel like we're losing that by saying to people, "Oh, what sport do you play back home? We'll fund you to start a, Aztecan, stick game or something." Or, I feel like Australia is getting away from that. There are certain things that unite us all, and we're just kind of going to passively get everyone behind them. And now everyone is a special, unique snowflake who has to have their culture and respected. And,
I would say just be patient. I think, we've had two great migration waves in this country, right? Post-Second World War, 2 million, largely from Europe, come to this country, including the UK, in very significant numbers, and reshaped the political landscape of this country in a very big way. There was 27 new federal seats created by that migration wave, including British expats. So then, and that took 30 years for that cycle to finish, right? And so we now are comfortable, and we see the end result of that. We now, and John Howard started this, the second great migration wave, and that was largely skilled migration wave, which is proportionally the same size, but obviously from a volume perspective, much larger. But proportionally, when compared to the population of Australia back then, it's relatively the same size, but much larger, obviously, because our population is much larger. That is still in its infancy. We're probably got another 20 years before we'll see the end of that too. And so what I'm saying is that the beauty about these sort of chats is we can have nuanced conversations about it. And equally, there's things that I agree with what you're saying, and there's things that I like in the discussion to be more nuanced, because it's just, we've not seen the end of it.
Which you certainly don't get in our Twitter mentions, which is basically just epithets and abuse. Look, I mean, I do wonder though. I mean, look, maybe your observations might be different, but I mean, my experience of politics, particularly in New South Wales, was that I just don't think you did see a particularly profound impact on our politics from that last wave of immigration because of that assimilating impulse, where, migrant communities got behind our politicians. I mean, I always use the example of Cabramatta, the seat of Cabramatta in New South Wales, with Newman, and then, sadly died recently, Nick Lalage, right? We now have this culture in Australia, and I mean, you have done this yourself, where we're, pressuring politicians and saying, oh, you need to reflect the diversity of your electorate in your lineup of politicians. Nick Lalage holds that seat for, God, I think almost 30 years. He's the whitest man who's ever lived. He looks like Frank Sinatra, beloved by that community, because the way that community thought was, I've come to this country, I want to be an Australian. What better expression of Australianness is voting for the most Australian-looking guy? We ran, the Liberals, when I worked for them in 2011, we ran Di Lee against him, and she lost. In the 2011 election, a landslide win for the Liberals, one of the few seats that were marginal that we couldn't get off you guys, was Nick Lalage in Cabramatta, because we couldn't win Vietnamese with a Vietnamese woman. And it felt to me for many years that, I mean, we all talked about the ethnic vote or whatever, but it just really seemed like a second order principle. When you had John Howard holding the seat of Bennelong, and then when he finally loses it because of the Chinese community turning on him, they elected Maxine McHugh, like the white lady from Central Casting. It just never felt like migrant communities were flexing their weight in that way, but they are now.
Well, kind of. So they diverse voters look for a standard bearer. So Di Lee's vote in Fowler in 2022 was largely under the age of 40 and overwhelmingly diverse, but lots of Assyrian Christians voted for her, right? Obviously Vietnamese and Southeast Asians as well, but she had an absolute rainbow of different types of people from different parts of the community voting for her, because she was the standard bearer that basically said "F you" to the political establishment, which younger Australians who were born here to migrant parents are looking to do the same thing. We'll go back to that initial conversation we're having about, don't think for a minute that diverse young people don't have the same problems as people who are not diverse and of the same age. They're just as angry, right? And they're expressing it in different ways. And we could see that with Fowler. Fowler's like the absolute epicenter. And they re-elected her, right? She got re-elected, right?
Yeah.
And we're going to see more of that. In my federal seat of call, there was Labor's primary vote collapsed. We knew that was going to happen. because the anger amongst younger, diverse Australians is immense. But it manifests in different ways. They weren't going to vote Liberal, right?
I think they're all in for...
I was going to say, what if that anger were to be like directed? My concern long term is if that anger were to be directed in a racial direction against white Australians, because this is just, obviously this is anecdotal, but I see this on TikTok, for example. Like I see videos with tens of thousands of likes by, say, different people of different backgrounds, and they will be like quite racially aggressive against, say, like white Australians, like calling white Australians all colonizers, calling them all genocidal, calling them bogans, all this sorts of thing.
But we as human beings, right? I mean, this online thing, and it isn't me showing my age here, because I've been in the online world for a long time, since the internet was invented. I always say this to people. I don't take much what goes online all that to heart, because I know that if I'm in person with someone, they're not going to say that to me. Right?
True, that is true.
Yeah. But I mean, look, my point.
The online world is just an amplification of all our anxieties and our anger and our frustration.
I agree with Kos, because Drew, what you're talking about, this language and this rhetoric that we're seeing, whether it's from migrants or from fellow white people, right? This isn't something that's gestating online. They learn that in our schools.
It's coming from white leftists a lot of the time.
School,
and it's a lot of the time coming from white leftists.
They're getting it from textbooks at university, right? So it's not like we have a problem with migrants and, diverse communities, whatever we call them, suddenly developing a problem with white people. Our own leaders in this country have a problem with white people, right? And they teach it to students. So, I mean, if you want to fix things, I mean, I think, fixing how we teach kids, I mean, from the ground up on social issues is something we need to look at.
I guess what I'm concerned about, like, you see rhetoric these days, like some of the leaders of the Palestine protests and stuff like that have actually been calling for like the abolition of an Anzac Day, the abolition of the War Memorial. I know these people are quite marginal, but I guess what I'm concerned about, Kos, is if there is less pressure for assimilation, and over the next 20, 30 years, if, say, like 2050, 2060, like traditions like, say, Anzac Day and stuff like that are just like completely devalued and just not part of Australian society and nationhood, that's what I'm concerned about when it comes to mass cultural change.
I'm probably going to be a little bit more, I would say, careful in how I answer that, because, and the reason for that is that, see, your world is different to mine.
Yeah.
And that's not because when you've grown up with the phone in your hand. Right?
Yeah.
Internet has been part of your life. It was part of mine, but it was tethered to the desk.
Yeah.
Right? So for me, what people say online is not necessarily my real world.
Yeah.
Younger people's emotionally respond a lot more to what goes online than older people do, and it's simply because
that's true.
We had freaking TVs that were, they're sitting on the desk that we watched, right? So I'm paying respect to your view here. I'm trying to say.
I get you there.
I can't.
The thing is, I think what my experience of it is, we look at what these kids are doing online. It's like, you're kind of doing social archaeology in a way when they say things like, Drew. Kos was being attacked in a thread about this debate the other day with people calling him a Zionist, and you end up doing this archaeological dig, saying, well, hang on, how does this person get there, right?
Yeah,
and not many people do that. Most people just kind of let the dopamine hit of the feed kind of sweep over them. When you really look at where so much of this stuff that the kind of more ridiculous people online go on with, that then gets picked up, that you then see repeated via the algorithm on TikTok or wherever, and it's not coming externally. It's coming, the call is coming from inside the house. These are messages that are being repeated. These are coming from the Australian establishment, and some of them are filtering through in different directions, right? It would never have been okay for a politician 20 years ago to stand in the chamber advocating for Israel or Palestine, right? It was just, these were just little motions that used to come up and you'd flick. I mean, and you get into trouble for them sometimes. I mean, I used to get, angry phone calls from the Turkish consulate whenever we'd have MPs talking about the Armenian genocide. This wasn't a big deal. Right. Today, when our MPs do it, whether it's on Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, or whatever, I mean, it's World War III in that place. right? It's like there has been this significant change in culture from our politicians. And I mean, young people are like sponges, and I think they're looking at what's going on around them going, well, this is what we do now, right? We scream at our enemies and we sledge them and use
part of why I've become slightly more conservative on these issues, like I see this really strong mood among so many people in my generation, like this trend to say, like, Australia really is evil from its inception. Australia should be abolished. Like, you actually see these signs at a lot of.
Well, that was written on signs at protests.
Yeah. I guess my concern is just that what actually is the glue that holds the country together. That's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, and look, I'll put a caveat to that though, Drew. I mean, your networks are probably not normal. It's not.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
I don't know though, because he's at uni, right? I mean, so when Drew says a lot of this stuff, what he's talking about are the things you see on any campus in Australia. If you're lucky enough to go to one that isn't like 100% international students, then and that's kind of these guys' experience. Like when you go on campus, this is the stuff you're confronted with. I mean, don't have a recent experience with it, but it used to be back when people actually joined the Liberal Party. This used to be how we recruited on campus, right? Yeah, because kids would go to school and they'd be shocked. They'd be like, wow, are you saying that about Anzac Day? You're saying that about Australians? We used to recruit based on that. I mean, they haven't recruited a new young Liberal, I don't believe, in the youngest one now is currently 35. So it's been a while since they've done it. Yeah.
I think Freya Leach is the last one. She's
the last one. Yeah. Well, maybe they'll get more because I hope they get Sky News shows. But so I get what you're saying that it's different for everyone. But I think like Drew's experience particularly the Australian students' experience is of that stuff happening. And this is one of the problems. Yeah. One of the problems with how we live today is so much content is algorithmic, and the more extremely online you are, your tastes affect everyone else's tastes. Right?
Yeah. So I guess I come from Sorry to interrupt. So I come from my perspective, because my day job is a researcher, right? And we have long form conversations with hundreds upon hundreds of Australians in a very different setting, right? And they could be Liberal, One Nation, they could be people who vote for the shooters, they could be Labor, they could be Green, whatever it is. And everyone's just a bit more nuanced, right? So you get them in a different environment, and the conversation's a bit more humane. Right, and so that's
true.
I mean, it's always like that. In focus groups, like especially when you have a bunch of people around a table, like everyone moderates each other, right? Like, but I mean, this is part of the problem with our modern society is there's no moderation between someone's relationship with their phone, right? Because you and I aren't real people to the guys on Twitter who read our posts, right? I mean, like coming up to this, like I had multiple people say to me, "Oh, you've got to go after Kos on this obscure tweet he did," right? Or people are saying it. There's people saying it about me, and I'm like, it's not real life. And occasionally you snap back at people in the comments and say something dumb. And it's not necessarily valuable to respond to every little thing. But this is what they're like now. And there's these gotcha moments with us screenshot things and hold them up for years and say, remember this time you admitted to being a Zionist? I mean, it's worse for you. I don't get it as much because, I admitted to worse political positions than that.
Besides, in the early days of the conflict where, Jewish Australians are being targeted unnecessarily, and I thought, hang on a minute, this is conflating it to our streets, which it shouldn't be. I've stayed away from the issue because it is an absolute.
It is poisonous. It is really poisonous, honestly.
It's bad news on multiple fronts. Not expressing a view, anyone watching, not expressing a view.
Yeah. But I mean, that used to be the kind of consensus in politics, right? I mean, I remember like no one ever expressing their view on it because it was that vexed. And a part of that was bad because, there's a lot of pressure from lobby groups and so forth to not say things about it. But you really do have to wonder, was the peer pressure across the board that people used to experience not better? Was that not a better way to live, that everyone kind of moderated a little bit and we didn't have these discussions? I don't know. But it does seem like the country is getting more volatile and more...
It would be, because
I don't think we're at the...
Because you're seeing that online, right? And so we go back to the point we're talking about, younger Australians in particular, the way they express their frustrations will be online. And it's... and have its different manifestations. It could be progressive, it could be right wing, could be whatever it is. It's all out there, right? And we see it. people want to fix it. They've got to fix the economic undercurrents at the moment. That's been inflicted upon millions of Australians at the moment.
How do you think that our political system is part of the problem here, Kos? Because I think part of the problem is that it's really difficult for change to reach the major parties due to the pre-selection system, due to the way they kind of seem to be very closed shops. It seems that Australian politics is really resistant to sort of outside change and from
argue the opposite.
Okay.
So you look at what happened in 2025, right?
Yeah.
Labor won with a 35% primary and relies heavily on a preference flow structure. And heavily upon that younger generation that will preference them above anyone else when it comes to after they voted for a minor party. That's still a very tenuous, precarious political strategy, right? Because that doesn't last forever. The Liberal Party had its worst results since 1943. Major party vote is been on the decline now for at least 10 to 15 years. People are increasingly voting for independence. You know, in 2010, we had 8 non-classical contests. That is, the AC defines them as non-classical. That is, the 2 majors weren't involved in the contest. It was someone else also. It was up to like 35, 36 at this election.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is what's going on here. Right. And so there's no safe seats left. So I can tell you in Victoria, the Labor camp, they're now very careful who they pre-select. They have to be, because the seat could go from being, oh, that was once upon a time a safe seat, it's now no longer a safe seat. And the Liberals were the same. I mean, they've lost menzies.
Yeah. But I mean, there is a slight difference, though, which between when you talk about what Drew's point on pre-selections, which is that the Labor Party has systems and processes on pre-selections. So when these guys, you know, when they're in the mix, there's boxes they've ticked, there's experiences they've had. They come from a background that Labor has decided they value. Like, you have to have been in the union movement, or you have to have been in local government. You have to have something that you bring to the table. In the Liberal Party, you bring pre-selectors to the table. Like, if you had enough pre-selectors, you can get it. And
I guess my problem, I guess my question is,
I mean, it's not, you know, you have this kind of like evening out in the Labor Party. I mean, I think it's a problem that a lot of Labor, like the overwhelming majority of Labor people, are like intellectually interchangeable for that reason. But at least there's a baseline for them. The Liberals just don't have that.
The point I was going to make was, I know
backgrounds these days too. Still,
I know Darren Firth has made this point before, because like it's like this seems to be particularly a problem with Labor, like where it's all the Labor MPs are coming from the same social and educational milieu. Like it seems to be, it's changing a little bit, but it does seem to be that like it is overwhelmingly dominated by kind of staffer class.
But let's walk all their lives back to where they came from, right? And so I've seen this, and it needs to be a little bit more reflective of who it represents. There's no doubt about that, and in a genuine way. But most of them come from lower middle class, poor backgrounds. Still to this day, it's why they're just hungrier to win, right?
True.
Yeah.
It's not like
Kos is actually exactly right on that stuff.
Yeah.
And like, because I've always joked that, you know, politics is actually one of the quickest ways for working class people to 100%. Migrate class in this country.
True.
Like, there's really nothing else. I mean, we're not like the United States where you can have a good idea and work hard and you can start a business and become a billionaire. That just simply does not happen in Australia. If you want to go from zero to a nice, healthy house portfolio, an inexhaustible superannuation, as well as
literally become an MP.
Yeah, I mean, access to future employment and all the most powerful people, you can just walk into O Week and get a membership form for one of the youth parties, and you can potentially be in Parliament quicker than you can get your degree. Right.
That's true.
Kos is absolutely right. That's why when you look at where, I mean, I get annoyed at this. The left talk about it all the time. They're like, oh, they're all Silvertails. They're all because they own a bunch of houses. No. I mean, you can criticize Albanese as much as you want, but Albanese is not unique. These people are working class. In the Liberal Party, they're middle class. But these aren't rich folks. There's very few rich people. I mean, the richest person who's ever been in our Parliament was Malcolm Turnbull, and just quietly, through 30 million isn't that much anymore, right? Like, it's not like he was that rich.
No, that's true. But it does seem to be like, I'll give you an example. Like, I was watching the new Labor left MPs give their maiden speeches, and a lot of the new Labor left MPs, they mentioned in their speech, like, you know, the fact that Australia is stolen land, the fact that Australia is founded on like genocide and the White Australia policy and all these sorts of things. And I just was thinking, like, it doesn't seem to be the case that there are many Labor MPs that come from, say, or who might not come from a sort of socially progressive background these days in terms of cultural issues. It seems to be, at least like on cultural stuff, it does seem to be quite a hegemonic sort of force, a sort of university educated type mindset in the Labor Party.
Yes. I mean, we can have a debate as to whether you need to acknowledge First Nations people or not, but that's not really, I mean, Bastion Abdo, who I, personally know and was very happy to see him succeed. I mean, you want to know someone who's come from absolutely dirt poor, penniless, absolute nothing in life, and developed a career in the private sector. Now is in Parliament. His speech was pretty good, right? So there were some.
Yeah,
good
no, that's true. No, I agree. There were some, and look,
I did kind of think on this stuff, though, Drew, that diving into these guys' backgrounds is kind of irrelevant, because what matters is where you are when you're there, right? And coming from nothing. I mean, if you're just going to forget where you came from, like, does it really matter where you came from? And guys like in state politics, you had guys who had come from nothing and done really well out of it, but they still passed policies that were, to the detriment of poor people. And then you have guys who, were successful and never forgot where they came from and were great to everyone. So there is a mix, but I just think you got to be cautious just going back to their backgrounds. When the second, I mean, this happened to me, and I'm sure Kos's background on this is very similar. When I was a kid and I joined the Liberal Party, they made me a senior staffer within like maybe 18 months, and back in $2004, it was almost twice as much money as the average wage if I had left uni. Like
I see a lot. I see that happen a lot.
$60,000 a year. So what is my upbringing as a working class kid from Hobart? What does that mean when I'm sitting in an office in Canberra with more money than my parents made? Right.
I see that a lot with young kids.
We need people from diverse backgrounds. It doesn't really matter once you're out and the first paycheck arrives. I think it just kind of becomes irrelevant, and that goes to the problem about hiring so many staffers.
The key ingredient there is, and we're all different, and you'll get that across all of politics. There will be people on the Conservative side who end up working in politics that never forget where they come from, and those who forget where they come from. And that's the same with the Labor camp as well, right? There's Tony Barry, my offsider, middle class, lower middle class, Mackay lad, has not forgotten where he's come from, right? Again, atypical liberal, socially conservative from lower middle class Australia. But then there's some that do, right? And it's just you find them in the private sector. It's the same thing, right?
I just think at a political level, this stuff really just shouldn't matter. And this is one of the reasons why why we have so many questions when stuff happens and say, well, is it just rank incompetence? Because we are selecting these people on the wrong basis so often. Because as you say, it was always something we said in the early 2000s, like all the easy decisions had been taken. Like by the time I started working in politics, the easiest wins had already been done. We'd invented Medicare. We'd done superannuation. We'd created all the safety nets. We'd dragged the country out of a recession in the early 90s. Howard then had to deal with 9/11, ban guns, and that's really it. And since then, we've been playing around the margins because all the biggest decisions have already been made. Now, instead of then saying, well, then we're going to need an even more exceptional caliber of politician than that we had in the 90s, we've said, okay, well, let's just give it to staffers and see what happens, right? And I mean, the hardest thing you can do in this country is pre-select a successful and intelligent person to Parliament. Most of them fail, and when they do, it's extremely hard. And then they spend the whole time looking over their shoulder and they do nothing. Like Malcolm Turnbull, for example.
The last significant reform in this country was Howard with the GST, and then before that was Hawke and Keating.
Well, I mean, you could argue strongly that the biggest reform to this country, not something I think we'll ever look back on and say it was great, is the NDIS. I mean, the NDIS is a challenge that successive governments are going to be untangling for generations. The NDIS scheme, and trying to get it back to something that resembles what it was meant to be and isn't just a rorted scam that is sucking, it's almost sucking the life out of our country as we become a country. Like you said, we're a simple economy. Well, our economy seems to rely on pulling dinosaur bones out of the ground, looking after disabled people, and making sure house prices never go down. Like, that's what the Australian economy is now about. When 50% of the country is employed by the government, the New South Wales government is the largest employer in the Southern Hemisphere. Right? That stat came out this week. Right. And the biggest employer in the Northern Hemisphere, by the way, is the Pentagon. So when that is what the Australian economy looks like, driven by public services and by the private provision of public services, I mean, what hope is there for us? No wonder kids are despondent, and half of them are going out there burning Australian flags, and the other half are getting them tattooed on their foreheads under their black masks. That's the future we're facing.
For reform, right? That's the fundamental thing. They're starving for reform, and they're getting band-aids, and this is the problem at the moment, right? And so if and I say this to politicians all the time, if you want to avoid social unrest, which will come, you have to tackle the big issues. And
well, I'm glad you said that, because that's my view on this whole thing, is that we are hurtling towards on a trajectory that leads Australia either to civil unrest, where the outcome of that is just depends on who wins the argument, which means either I'm in jail or you're in jail. So, and Drew's probably dead. So that's one direction we're hurtling to.
And the other is that meant.
So, or otherwise you end up with, do we find someone who can fix the problem? Like, do we find a politician who can fix it, or a new party or something? Does someone come along with a new policy prescription? Because I just really don't see that on the horizon right now.
Can I ask you a question, Kos?
Last question, Drew. So
last question, because I know we've got to go. What do you think makes an Australian? Like, at what point? Obviously, there's the actual legal requirement, and you get citizenship and stuff like that. But then you've got situations as well. Like, for example, like those two nurses in West Sydney who said live on camera that if they had a Zionist patient, they would kill them and stuff like that. And obviously, that was such a horrific thing. Like, it's very hard for people to say that those guys have Australian values, right? And so I guess the question becomes, how do we actually define an Australian? And like, what role do you think assimilation should be part of it? And how do we avoid fears of cultural dislocation and unrest like that?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, I think for all the faults of the United States, I mean, they still, when they do their census, they ask, how do you identify yourselves ethnically? Number one answer, the number one group is German. The second one is like, you go like German, Irish, Italian. But by the way, who are you? I'm an American.
Yeah.
So we've got a way to go yet, right? We're a young country, and it would be nice to see a day where, I'm Greek, but I'm an Australian. Or I'm Turkish, but I'm an Australian. Now, a lot of them would say that to this day. A lot of them do that, but we've got a way to go.
Yeah. I mean, I agree on that point. I mean, I just think for what you're saying though is this point that we don't. I mean, when you say the Americans have got there, Americans brought themselves there. I mean, kids in America grew up swearing an oath to their country in classrooms. Right, American children learned exclusively about the creation of their own country and the meaning of their constitution. American children who get into college can almost universally name every single one of their presidents, and they've been a country twice as long as we have. So, how many Australians can name them after Edmund Barton? Right? I mean, we have a problem with civics in this country. We're not interested in fixing it because, when kids get to school, we want to spend 12 months teaching them about sex education and all the different pronouns, and then we're going to teach them about a black armband view of their nation's history, and that the people who look like us are the bad guys, right? So getting to that point where, like with Americans, where whether you're an African American or a German American, you're an American first, it requires a level of social engineering that in this country we were doing for a long time. We were on the
seems like we've given up on that,
and then we just stopped, right?
Yeah, look, I'd say just the last point here. I would say that that again, it's how old we are compared to a country like the US. So, you go back to the early 1900s, they had a lot of problems, social unrest, particularly in New York.
True.
Right? Massive sectarianism, right?
True.
And so
that is true.
Civil unrest was the key thing that plagued their country for a very long time. That is civil war, freaking right. I mean,
yeah.
And so they've had massive upheavals throughout the entire course of their history. We've been fortunate; we haven't had that, and we just need to be a little bit more patient with ourselves. That's my closing remarks.
I think that's a good way to end it. But yeah.
No, look, both. I want to thank both of you guys. Thank you so much, Kos and John. Honestly, that was a really interesting discussion, and I like that. Obviously, everyone had a different political background, but it was actually very respectful and it was actually very intelligent. So I really appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks so much, Kos.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Kos.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks, mate. Thank you so much.